Hello, class. So today we are beginning our learning cycle for Unit 4.2, which focuses on how westward expansion intensified conflict in the United States, especially around the issue of slavery. In our last learning cycle, we examined how westward movement as a force shaped communities for both settlers, indigenous peoples, and enslaved Africans. And today we're building on that idea, but we are shifting our focus to conflict, how movement into new territories forced the United States to confront unresolved questions about power, labor, land, and freedom. So as Americans moved west, they did not just bring all of their belongings and pack them up in wagons. They also carried their political beliefs, economic systems, and their deeply rooted disagreements. Each new territory raised the same explosive question: would slavery expand or be restricted? And every attempt to answer that question exposed how divided the nation had become. So by the end of this learning cycle, you should be able to explain not only what happened during this time period, but also explain why compromise repeatedly failed. Okay? You should have your guided notes package in front of you. This is not optional, okay? This is your main learning tool for today. Every slide you see on the screen matches a section in your notes. So when you see a blank, that means I expect you to write something down. The wording on the slide is the wording you should be listening for. I will pause periodically after I say important ideas to give you time to write, but you also need to stay engaged and do not wait until the end of the slide to start writing. Fill in the blanks as we go, and if you miss something, rewatch the video or just raise your hand for clarification. Okay, so this is slide 1 in our guided notes. And before I begin listing laws, dates, and all the compromises we're going to cover, I want to just pause and help us understand the shift that happens during this period. Slavery did not suddenly appear in the 1820s. It existed in the United States for centuries. What did change was the way slavery functioned politically. So before we have this large-scale westward expansion, many Americans, especially white Northerners, they imagined slavery as something distant, something that was contained in the South and ultimately someone else's problem. Basically, what I'm trying to get you to understand is that prior to westward expansion, a lot of white folks in the North, they understood slavery as something that was in the South. That didn't have anything to do with them. It was a Southern thing primarily. It did not demand their attention on a daily basis. However, westward expansion changed that. It shattered that illusion that Northerners didn't have anything to do with slavery. So as the United States grew, slavery followed the nation's border, and it became impossible for some white people to avoid it, to not think about it. Every new piece of land, every new state, every new territory forced Americans to confront the same question: would slavery expand with the nation or would it be limited? This was not a simple moral debate. It was a political struggle over power, representation, and who would control the future of the country. So from this point forward, slavery was no longer just a Southern institution. It became a national crisis that affected every region. It was always a national crisis. It was at this point that white Northerners became more conscious of this as a national crisis. Okay, because black folks already knew it was a national crisis, but it was at this point white folks in the North became aware that this was a national crisis that they could no longer ignore. As you take notes today, I want you to think of expansion not as something that created new conflict, but as something that exposed the conflicts that already existed. Expansion, westward expansion, forced Americans to confront slavery repeatedly. You had to deal with the question of slavery. Okay? Now, let's pause and answer the question on your guided notes. The question is, why did westward expansion make slavery harder for Americans to ignore than it had been before? To answer this, we're going to break the question into parts in your notes. So first, you want to explain how slavery could be ignored before expansion. Before expansion, right, it was mainly located in the South. A lot of people thought it didn't have anything to do with them, that it only affected in the South. However, expansion changed that. So now your answer should talk about how expansion changed that. So new land, new states, new political decisions forced Americans to now think about slavery. It now forced the nation to pay attention to power in Congress, who's getting representation, what will the future of the nation look like. So you can pause this video right here to take time to answer your question, but your answer should explain the sort of cause and effect, how expansion turned slavery from a distant issue into a national political crisis. Now, on to slide 2. After the War of 1812, the United States entered a period of rapid growth and transformation. The War of 1812 was fought between the United States and Great Britain, and it confirmed that the United States will remain independent and in control of its own trade and territory. Although the war ended without a clear military victory, wasn't sure if the British won or if Americans won, many Americans viewed it as a success because it strengthened their national pride and reduced foreign interference in the U.S. affairs. So following the war, the population increased in America, and quickly the land in the East became more expensive, and new roads, canals, and transportation networks made Western travel easier and more affordable. So now a lot of white folks felt like this was their prime opportunity to move west. For many Americans, moving west appeared to offer a fresh start, a chance to improve their lives. Remember, we talked about this last week. Westward expansion was widely framed as positive, independence, freedom. And politicians, newspapers, land promoters, they describe Western land as a path to independence, a path to economic opportunity, and a way to democratically participate in the nation. Owning land was closely tied to freedom, citizenship, and social mobility. So in this narrative, expansion represented progress, not conflict. However, this optimistic and positive view, it overlooked the serious political consequences of moving west. Each new territory was not just land to be settled, it was a future state. That meant representation in Congress, influence over national laws, and power in the federal government. So expansion forced Americans to make repeated decisions about slavery, balance of power, and the direction of the nation. Kind of let me break down what I'm saying. Westward expansion wasn't just positive and optimistic experience, right? It was also something that was heavily politically convoluted, right? There was a lot of conflict at this time because each time a new state or new territory was created, they had to ask themselves, would slavery exist in this space? Which made it political, which made it messy, okay? And these consequences, right, they were rarely discussed when expansion was celebrated. Now I want you to pause and answer the guided question, the question in your guided notes. Why did Americans view expansion as a positive at first? And what important political consequences were overlooked? Again, as you're writing your response, you want to break it down into parts. So first, in your answer, you should explain why expansion seemed positive. There was national pride, economic opportunity, freedom, land ownership. So this was how they viewed it at first, as a positive. Next, in your response, you need to explain, what did they overlook? What did they not pay attention to, right? They didn't pay attention to slavery debates, how this would impact the balance of power. And in your answer, you should contrast how their early optimism and positivity about expansion ignored the political conflicts that expansion would eventually expose. If you're not done writing down your answer, you can pause the video at this point to make sure you have written your response before moving on. Slide 3. By the early 19th century, the United States was increasingly divided into regions with distinct economic systems, labor needs, and political goals. These regional differences did not just influence daily life, they shaped how Americans understood slavery and expansion. Now, when I say regional differences, we're talking about the different locations in the country, the North, the South, the West. These places all operated differently economically, politically, and socially. In the North, the economy relied more heavily on free labor, wage work, which means they earned money, wage is your money, manufacturing, and growing cities. So because northern industries did not depend on enslaved labor, many northerners viewed slavery as unnecessary and increasingly dangerous to democratic ideals. Expansion then raised concerns that slaveholding states would gain too much political power. So the North did not want the West to become a slave states. In the South, the economy was deeply dependent on enslaved labor, particularly in plantation agriculture such as cotton, tobacco. Slavery was not only central to Southern wealth, but also to Southern political influence. Limiting slavery's expansion threatened the South's economic stability and its ability to maintain power in the federal government. The West represented uncertainty. Its future, would it be free or slave? They had not yet decided what the West would look like. This made Western territories the center of political conflict as each section, the North and the South, competed to shape the region's economic system and political identity. The North wanted the West to be a place where free labor and industry could bloom. The South wanted the West to be a place where slavery could expand. So the North and the South were in disagreement about what the West should look like. Now, in your notes, you're going to now, in your guided notes, answer the following question. How did differences in regional economies shape each section's position on slavery and expansion? So how did their different economic uh, approaches shape how they viewed westward expansion and slavery? So in your answer, you want to be sure that you first explain the northern economy and how it influenced northern views on slavery and expansion. Next, explain the southern economy and why slavery's expansion was critical to southern power. You just want to be sure that you explain why the West mattered and why both regions, the North and the South, competed for their influence. If you want to pause the video, this will be a good time now to pause the video and write down your response. Okay, this is slide 4. We're going to talk about the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise was the first major attempt to manage the social conflict caused by westward expansion. When Missouri applied for statehood as a slave state, Northerners feared that admitting it would upset the balance of power in Congress. At the time, there was an equal number of free and slave states, and that balance mattered deeply. So essentially, before Missouri wanted to become a state, you can see Missouri located here, right? Before Missouri became a state, was an equal balance between free states and slave states. So the free states are these states in red here, and the slave states are the states in green here on the map. So prior to Missouri becoming a state, there was an equal balance. So they wanted to keep it this way. The North didn't want the South to have more slave states, and the South did not want the North to have more free states. They wanted to keep it equal as possible. But that was difficult to manage as we began to steal more land in the West. So they created a compromise, okay? And in this compromise, the um, the slave states got Missouri, and Maine, all the way up here, was admitted as a free state. So this helped to keep the balance in the Senate. It also drew a geographic line across the Louisiana Territory, allowing slavery south of the line and prohibiting it to the north. So, in short term, this solution reduced tension and allowed the nation to move forward without immediate conflict. Okay, so again, looking at this line, you see this red line across the Arkansas Territory. The Missouri Compromise essentially said states at the north of this line at the top would be free, and any states below the line would be slave states. So this was their compromise in 1820. However, the compromise did not address the deeper disagreement over slavery itself. Instead of confronting whether slavery should continue or expand, Congress treated slavery as just a geographic issue. Okay? This is just an issue we can just solve by creating this line, something that could be managed by drawing a line on a map. This essentially avoided the difficult moral, economic, and political questions, but it did not resolve them. Okay? So by postponing the conflict rather than solving it, the Missouri Compromise set a precedent for future compromises that relied on delay instead of resolution. Each time the nation expanded, the same conflict resurfaced, often with more intensity. Would this be a slave state or would this be a free state? They kept having to answer that question. Now you're going to pause and answer the guided notes question. Why did the Missouri Compromise solve a political problem in the short term but fail to resolve the deeper conflict over slavery? Okay, again, you want to make sure that your answer is broken down into parts. You want to be sure that you explain what problem the compromise solved in the short term. In the short term, it solved the balance of power in Congress. It created a temporary peace between the North and the South. You also want to make sure that your answer explains why it failed to resolve the problem long term. And it failed because it did not answer whether slavery should expand. It did not tackle the moral and political disagreements. Okay? At this point, if you want to pause the video to write down your answer, you should do so. All right. And now we have a quick break for your segment 1 review. You have 5 multiple choice questions. You need to answer those multiple choice questions on your own. And then once you are done answering those questions, you should resume the lecture. All right. Now we're moving on to segment 2. This is slide 5. The Missouri Compromise depended on stability, right? Picking up with the Missouri Compromise. It created a predictable balance between free and slave states. So as long as the number of free and slave states remained equal, lawmakers believed that sectional conflict would be managed. They could keep the North and the South happy. So as they continued to expand west, it made it very difficult for this balance to be maintained. Every new territory forced Congress to revisit the same unresolved question. Would slavery be allowed or restricted? So agreements that were once treated as permanent solutions quickly became just temporary fixes. Each new debate weakened the trust between regions and made earlier compromises feel less reliable. Rather than settling conflict, expansion multiplied it. So westward expansion led to an increase in conflict. Every new territory, every new state forced the country to be in conflict because it forced the country to really decide what would be the future of slavery. So the repeated need for compromise revealed that the previous solutions were not effective. They were not working. Okay, so as you now looking at your question for this slide, why did continued expansion make earlier compromises unstable rather than permanent? So as the country continued to expand west, the compromises that they had made in the past no longer could work. The earlier compromises depended on there being a balance between free and slave states. So the country kept trying to make sure that the free and slave states were equal. However, this became very difficult to do so as we continue to steal land in the West. Okay. Take a few seconds to answer that question or pause the video, and then once you are done, you can continue on to the next slide. Okay. Now we're going to shift and talk about the Mexican-American War. This war was fought between the United States and Mexico from 1846 to 1848. The war began largely over disputes about territory following the U.S. annexation of Texas. Annexation is just when the U.S. stole Texas. So this part, all of this you see here in this like orange looking color, this was at once part of Mexico. And so was Texas. This was a part of the Mexican country. America took Texas and claimed it as part of their country. And so now Mexico and America engaged in a war between each other of deciding who actually had control over this land. Did this land belong to the United States or did this land belong to Mexico? And when the war ended, the United States defeated Mexico and they gained a massive amount of land, including much of what is now the Southwest and California. So we got all of this land, took it from Mexico during that war. These territorial gains dramatically intensified national debates over slavery and political power. The new lands were economically valuable and strategically important, and their future status, whether they would allow slavery or not, became the most central political question facing the nation at this time. So unlike earlier expansions, the sheer size of this land made it impossible to avoid or delay the issue. Now we had more land, and now the debate over would slavery exist in this land or not became even more intensified. So every time a new state was admitted, this debate increased. So would this be a slave state or a free state? So as a result, debates over expansion after the Mexican-American War were no longer sort of abstract. They were immediate, high stakes, and deeply divisive. This moment marks a turning point. Expansion could no longer just be managed quietly or gradually or with a simple geographical line. The nation was forced to confront the consequence of its growth, all at once. And compromise became increasingly difficult to sustain. It became difficult for both the North and the South to feel as if they were satisfied. Now, answer the question on your guided notes. How did land gain after the Mexican-American War intensified national debates over slavery and power? How did this intensify debates over slavery and power? First, you want to be sure that you explain what the Mexican-American War added to the United States. It added large amounts of new territory, new land. Then you want to be sure that you explain why this land mattered politically. It mattered politically because it intensified the debates over whether or not these lands would be slave states or if these lands would be free. Now you have to remember that every time it became a slave state, that meant the slave states would gain more power politically. If it became a free state, that means the northern free states would gain more power politically. So the North and South is fighting over who would have more political power, who would get to have more votes. Because if you have a new state, you can get those people to vote for you and your political interest. So the debate continued. Would these new lands become slave states or would they become free states? Who would get more political power, the North or the South? Okay, so you need to be sure to explain how these debates, how the Mexican-American War intensified these debates over slavery. You can pause the video here to write your answer, and then we'll pick up on the next slide. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the Wilmot Proviso, which was a proposal introduced in Congress that aims to ban slavery in any territory gained as a result of the Mexican-American War. So Congress presented this act proposal to essentially say that any land that was gained from the Mexican-American War would automatically be a free state. We will ban slavery in this territory. And although it was debated multiple times, this proposal never became law. Its repeated failure is significant not because of what it accomplished, but because of what it revealed. Northern lawmakers increasingly argued that slavery's expansion had to be stopped in order to protect free labor and prevent slaveholding states from dominating national politics. Southern lawmakers, on the other hand, viewed any restriction on slavery's expansion as a direct threat to their economic system and political power. Neither side was willing to compromise. Neither wanted to compromise on what it saw as a matter of survival. Both the North and the South believed that their approach was best. So the repeated failure of the Wilmot Proviso exposed again a deeper problem. Congress was becoming incapable of managing these sectional conflicts through legislation. Lawmakers could debate, delay, and block proposals, but they could not produce solutions that both the North and the South would accept. So the legislative process itself began to break down. They could not figure out how to keep both the North and the South happy. And so this moment marks a shift from tension to the country being paralyzed, stuck, not knowing how to move forward. They did not know how to solve this conflict, and the nation became even more divided. All right, now it's time to answer the question in your guided notes. What does the repeated failure of the Wilmot Proviso reveal about Congress' ability to manage sectional conflict? You need to be sure that you explain what the Wilmot Proviso attempted to do. The Wilmot Proviso attempted to limit slavery, the expansion of slavery in these new territories. You need to be sure you explain why it failed repeatedly. It failed repeatedly because it could not please both the North and the South. What the North wanted, they could not provide. What the South wanted, the Wilmot Proviso could not provide. This led to a deadlock. This led to Congress being stuck and paralyzed and not able to provide a solution that would be beneficial to both the North and the South. You can again pause the video here to write your response and then pick up on the next slide. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit more about how slavery functioned as more than an economic system in the United States. It was not just about the South making money. It was also a political system that shaped power at the national level. Enslaved labor generated enormous wealth for the Southern plantation owners, but it also increased Southern influence in the federal government. So through population counts, enslaved people were used to boost Southern representation in Congress, even though they had no political rights themselves. So let me break that down. The South was able to use enslaved people to count as part of their population. The more people you had in your state, the more representatives you could send to Congress. So they counted the Black people as part of their population, and therefore they could have more representation in Congress, and the South could have more power. However, the Black folks did not vote. They only used them as a part of their population count so that they can get more power. And so the North knew that this is what the South was doing. And so they didn't like it. They know that if the South began to increase and expand slavery, that they could have more people in their states and therefore more representation in Congress. So again, this gave slaveholding states greater power in the House of Representatives, and it helped protect slavery through federal law. The more representation the South had in Congress, the more they were able to make sure the laws that they wanted to pass were passed. So expansion mattered because each new slave state meant more political influence for the South. Limiting slavery's expansion threatened their system of power. So if new territories entered the United States as a free state, the South feared that they would lose their ability to shape national policy and to protect slavery where it already existed. So the debate was not just about labor or profit, it was about who could control the federal government, who could have more representatives in Congress. Think about this in today's society right now, right? Are the Republicans or the Democrats going to have more people in Congress, more seats in the House of Representatives? This is a debate or a phenomenon that still impacts our political, our politics today, right? And understanding this helps explain why the South was so resistant to limiting slavery. Because not only did limiting slavery limit their money, but it also limited their political power. Now, you're going to answer your question on your guided notes. Why was limiting slavery expansion seen as a threat to Southern political power and not just its economy? Again, you want to be sure that you break your response down. You want to be sure that you first explain how slavery increased Southern political power. The more representation they had in Congress meant the more power they had over federal laws. Now you want to explain why it mattered to them politically. Again, more states meant more power. So if slavery were to be limited, they would have less power, less political power. Again, you can pause the video now to finish your response, and then we'll pick up on the next slide. Okay, this is now where we pause for our segment 2 review. You again have 5 multiple choice questions that you need to answer. Once you are done answering those 5 multiple choice questions, we will pick up on the next slide. So, now we're going to talk about the Compromise of 1850. And this was one of the final major attempts to try to hold the nation together through negotiation. We were faced with growing sectional conflict after the Mexican-American War. A lot of lawmakers believed that carefully balancing concessions between free and slave state would preserve the Union. So they wanted to do another compromise. The compromise included measures to satisfy both the North and the South, right? But instead of just restoring stability, it exposed how fragile national unity had become. So this compromise, again, didn't work. Each region believed it had been forced to give up too much, while the other side gained unfair advantages. So in this compromise, the North felt like, no, the South is getting too many benefits. The South felt like, no, the North is getting too many benefits. They were not able to come together and agree with a compromise. So rather than building confidence and strengthening unity in the country, the compromise deepened suspicion and resentment. The North didn't trust the South. The South didn't trust the North. So most importantly, the Compromise of 1850 revealed that agreement no longer meant that there was no longer a shared understanding or mutual trust. Okay? And this will sort of break down what the Compromise of 1850 was. California, which was a part of the Mexican-American territory that we won from Mexico, California became a free state. This also led to an increase in fugitive slave laws. So it attempted to give the North a free state, but then also increase fugitive slave laws to help the South, but neither side thought it was enough. So the result was not peace, but again, another temporary pause that left underlying conflicts unresolved and even more intensified. Again, so conflict just begins to, and tension just continues to build and build and build. Now, it's time for you to answer your next guided notes question. Why did the Compromise of 1850 increase tension instead of restoring trust between these regions, the North and the South? You need to be sure that you explain what the compromise attempted to do. The Compromise of 1850 attempted to create a balance so that it could benefit the North and the South and to preserve the Union. The compromise wanted to keep the Union together and strong. Now you need to explain in your answer how each side responded. Both felt as if they were forced to give up more and that the other side got more benefits, and then it created a sense of distrust. The North no longer trusted the South, and the South no longer trusted the North, and they did not believe that it was possible to create a solution in which both groups could be pleased. You can pause the video here to finish your response, and we'll pick up on the next slide. So, the Fugitive Slave Act, which was a result of the Compromise of 1850, this was one of the most controversial parts of the Compromise of 1850. It essentially strengthened the federal enforcement of slavery by requiring citizens and local officials in free states to assist in capturing and returning escaped enslaved people. Think of this kind of like ICE today, in today's time. You had citizens who could now be empowered by the federal government to go around and snatch people up from their homes and say, hey, you are a slave. You need to go back to this slave state. Why are you in a free state? So you can just imagine Black people living in free states. So if I was a Black person living in California or living in Maine or living in Illinois, this law allowed for citizens, local citizens, and local political authority, police force, to snatch these people up and bring them back to the South. So you can imagine how this created tension and conflict, because essentially people who were free were forced into slavery. Okay? So this law, this Fugitive Slave Act, dramatically expanded the role of the federal government in protecting slavery. So now the federal government had more control and say over how slavery could be protected. And many Northerners, for them, this law was a turning point. They saw this as a mark in which the South began to have too much control. So while some Northerners had already previously opposed slavery in theory, they now began to forcibly disagree with slavery because they thought the South was getting too much power, right? So now the South was being able to control what happened in the North, and ordinary people could now be fined, thrown into jail, and face all type of consequences. And the North did not agree with this. This shift also explains why the resistance grew so rapidly. Many Northerners felt that the law violated their moral beliefs and undermined states' rights and personal freedom. The federal government should not be able to come into our state and snatch up our citizens. This is what Northerners believed. And the Fugitive Slave Act transformed opposition to slavery from just a passive disagreement into an active resistance. So those same Northerners who in the beginning was like, oh, that doesn't have anything to do with me, that's in the South, they now began to actively resist slavery. This again increased sectional tensions. The North became more upset with the South, and the South became more upset with the North. So your question for this slide: why did the Fugitive Slave Act turn slavery into a national issue for many Northerners who had previously opposed it from a distance? So essentially, why all of a sudden did a lot of white Northerners begin to care about slavery, begin to want to resist slavery? So you want to first explain how Northerners viewed slavery before the law. Before this law, they viewed slavery as something that was distant, something that was only in the South. And then you also want to explain how the Fugitive Slave Act changed their view. So this Fugitive Slave Act forced the federal government to now come into the northern states and control what happened in their states. And this is what they did not agree with. They felt it was an attack against their personal freedom and their states' rights. So now you can pause this video here to finish your writing out your response, and then we'll pick up on the next slide. Okay. So now we're going to talk a bit about agency and resistance. Okay. So although political leaders attempted to manage the conflict between the North and the South through laws and compromises. Individuals consistently shape events through their actions. So far we've talked a lot about what the federal government has done or political leaders have done, but now we're going to talk about individual people and their agency as well, because they are part of this history too. So these actions revealed the limits of political solutions and exposed how deeply slavery affected everyday life for the everyday individual. Enslaved people resisted slavery themselves. They also fighting against this system. They escaped. They self-emancipated themselves. There were everyday acts of defiance. They didn't follow laws. They pushed back. They wrote. They gave speeches. Okay? There was a lot of things that enslaved people and free people of color did every day to resist the system of slavery. We also have abolitionists who organized networks, challenged federal authority, and openly resisted laws like the Fugitive Slave Act. And their actions made the enforcement difficult and even more controversial. Settlers in Western territories also played a critical role. By choosing to either support or oppose slavery, they turned political debates into lived conflicts on the ground. So everyday people, right, were now participating in this conversation. Right, the family who packed up their wagon and moved west, now they're participating in a political debate. Should slavery be allowed or not? The settlers themselves are having to choose. White folks in the North are now participating in this conversation. Should slavery be allowed to grow or not? Black folks have always been participating in this conversation, right? And of course, they are fighting for slavery to not only be limited, but eradicated and abolished completely. Now you have a question on your guide in your guided note. The question is, how did the actions of individuals challenge the idea that slavery could be controlled through political compromise alone? So essentially, how did these individuals um, force us to think that, understand that compromise is not the solution? So first you need to talk about particular individuals or groups. You could talk about enslaved people, abolitionists, or settlers. And then you need to talk about what actions they took. We know enslaved people escaped, they had rebellions, right? We know that white settlers were forced to choose a side in these political debates. And then you need to explain what these actions revealed. And what they revealed is that laws could not fully control the behavior of individual people, nor could the laws alone resolve the conflict. Again, you can pause here to finish writing your response, and then we'll pick up on the next slide. All right. So we're towards the end of our video, and we're going to focus on our takeaways. So by the early 1850s, it was clear that political compromise had failed as a long-term governing strategy. For decades, lawmakers attempted to manage slavery by delaying decisions, drawing geographical lines, and trying to create a balance between the North and the South. But each compromise was presented as a solution, and in reality, it was just a sort of pause. It was just a temporary fix, a little band-aid. Westward expansion forced Americans to confront the issue of slavery repeatedly. And repeatedly, again and again, they had to ask themselves, what are we going to do about slavery? And each time it became more difficult for them to solve. So as the nation grew, compromise became harder to enforce. The trust between the North and the South just was eradicated, and political disagreements started to spill over into the everyday lives of people. We had more open resistance and violence, and our nation ultimately became extremely divided, which will eventually lead us to the Civil War in our next unit. But at this time, the Americans, again, were forced to confront slavery directly, and compromise was no longer possible. The nation had moved beyond just negotiation and trying to figure out a way to keep the North and the South happy. We were in a deeply divided point in our history. Now, your question for this slide. Why did delaying decisions about slavery through compromise ultimately make the conflict more severe? And you're going to break this question down into parts. You want to make sure that you first explain what compromise was doing. Compromise ultimately was just delaying the inevitable, creating only temporary fixes. Then you want to be sure that you explain how expansion and time changed the situation. The more land we had, the more territories we had gained, the more we debated about what we would do with those lands, if it would become free or slave, and the more our tensions between the North and the South increased. You also want to be sure that you explain why the delay made conflict worse. The North and the South began to lose trust in each other. People began to resist more. There was an escalation of violence. Okay. Again, you can pause here to add on to your response and pick up on the next slide, which is the last slide. All right, we've made it to the last slide, which is where you will complete your segment review. Again, you have 5 multiple choice questions that you need to answer. Once you have answered those 5 multiple choice questions, you have successfully completed your guided notes for this learning cycle. If there are any blanks on your paper, you can go back to a particular slide, rewatch it, pause it, and be sure to make sure your packet is complete.